Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library, located at the National First Ladies Historic Site here in Canton, Ohio. I want to welcome you to today's program. Whether you're tuning in with us live through Zoom or Facebook, or if you're accessing the program after the fact, we want to welcome you. Want to encourage you to take advantage of the chat function. Say hello, tell us where you're tuning in from. If you have a question for today's speaker, if you have an AV question about the sound or some other aspect of the program, we can certainly try to troubleshoot that with you as well. If you are tuning in through Eventbrite, we really encourage people to click out to open up Zoom. It seems that the sound and image work a little bit better through Zoom. So with that said, I want to tell you about some upcoming programs we are offering. We have quite a lot of programming happening in October. It's a very busy month for us here. Almost all of the programs are still virtual. So if you're tuning in from across the country, you can continue to connect with us. We are moving to some in-person programs, and there's one that I want to talk about. It's called East Wing Songs. It is the national debut of a musical performance inspired by the First Ladies. So we've worked with a composer who has created amazing music related to a few First Ladies, and we hope to continue this throughout the year. We'll have another program in the spring. We will live stream the program, but for anyone that is taking advantage of making a trip to Canton to see the National First Ladies Historic Site, we encourage you to come and check it out. We will be at the Presbyterian Church for this program. That's the church where Ida McKinley and William McKinley were married. We do have a really great Nancy Reagan exhibition with very cool special loans from the Reagan Library that are up through October. So we're very excited about that as well. And we want to encourage you to come out to Canton, see the National Park site, see the music and the great exhibition. I also want to mention our upcoming legacy lecture. So this is kind of school's back in session. Some of us are lucky enough to be enrolled as students, but you can enroll as a student with us at the National First Ladies Library and come to our regular monthly legacy lecture. So next month, November 2nd, we are excited to have another friend of the organization, Lud Depesh, will be with us, and Dr. Depesh is going to be speaking about Emily Donaldson. So if you are interested in First Lady surrogates, women who have filled in as First Ladies, Donaldson is an amazing one to start your studies with. Lots of interesting scandal, and I'm sure it will be a great discussion. So we're excited about that. Another great speaker that we have on October 11th, whether you get to join us for the film portion, we are still working with Stark Library to allow National First Ladies Library patrons to access films about women. And we are screening virtually a film that you can access in your home about Shirley Chisholm and her historic presidential run. The film's called Chisholm 72 Unbought and Unbossed. But as part of our discussion for the day, our Q&A will be with Dr. Anastasia Curwood, who has just written an amazing book about Shirley Chisholm. We're super excited to have Dr. Curwood, and we encourage you to go on our Eventbrite page and register for that. We also have a talk with a curator program that should be really great. It's kind of a Halloween theme. We're going to look at the Victorian death scene And our Ladies on the Page book club is going to be reading a great book, Lady Bird Johnson's Hiding in Plain Sight. So those are just some of the upcoming programs happening with the National First Ladies Library. We encourage you to go to our social media, to our Eventbrite page, and connect with us. I'll put some of those links in the chat as we're talking. Let's see. And I am going to start to turn things over to our speaker, but first I need to introduce her. Annette Dunlap has been a North Carolina-based freelance writer for over 30 years. She has written a variety of publications, and including op-eds for the Fayetteville Observer, the Charlotte Observer, and the Pilot in Moore County. She was a freelance reporter for the Asheboro Courier Tribune and has been a contributor to inspirational magazines, business publications, and most importantly to us, White House history. Annette is the author of Frank, the story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady, The Gambler's Daughter, and Charles Gate Dawes, A Life. Her biography of Lou Henry Hoover, A Woman of Adventure, The Life and Times of First Lady Lou Henry Hoover, has just been released by University of Nebraska Press, and we'll put a link to it in the chat. She has appeared on C-SPAN's First Lady series to discuss Frances Cleveland and Lou Henry Hoover, and was a panelist at the Harding Symposium's Modern First Ladies program in 2015. Her research on Frances Cleveland inspired the development of a program, First Ladies and the Politics of Fashion, which has been broadcast on C-SPAN. Annette holds a BA from the University of Arizona, an MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. She and her husband of 41 years live in North Carolina. They have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. She enjoys sewing, knitting, embroidery, and travel. So we are super excited to have Annette Dunlap, friend of the National First Ladies Library, here to discuss her new book. So welcome, Annette, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Allison. Good to be here. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time to spend either your lunch hour or the latter part of your morning with us. I was watching the names come in and the locations from the chat, and I'm just honored to have an opportunity to talk to so many of you across the country about Lou Henry Hoover. So let me go ahead and pull up the presentation, which has got some photographs of Lou in it, and we'll speak to those and talk a little bit about her. And hopefully my computer is going to remember how to behave, which sometimes it does and sometimes it does not. Come on, computer, wake up. There we go. All righty. So the program that we're going to have for this afternoon is going to focus on Lou in the White House. Herbert Hoover, as I'm sure most of you are aware, was a one-term president, 1929 to 1933. He did, of course, run for re-election in the 32 election against Franklin Roosevelt. But as many people say, people vote their pocketbook, and pocketbooks were not in great shape in 1932. And so Hoover lost pretty much, Hoover lost in a landslide to Roosevelt, ironically, the same landslide that against Al Smith that had put Hoover into office in 28. So she was a one-term first lady. But in those 4 years that she was in the White House, she made some tremendous contributions, many of which have been forgotten and lost. I think there are several reasons for that. One is that she was succeeded by Eleanor Roosevelt. I probably don't need to say anything else other than that. But the other is that Lou died in January of 1944 while the Roosevelts were still in office. Her husband outlived her by 20 years. In those 20 years, he had an opportunity to resurrect and mend his public image and his relationship with the writing of a 3-volume memoir. And then, unfortunately for the public, while he was going ahead and getting his reputation rehabilitated, he insisted that Lou's papers be sealed until 20 years after his death. So he died in October of 1964. Researchers did not start getting access to her prolific files until 1984, and we're still going through them and discovering things. So we're going to just look at a capsule of her life. And of course, if you're interested in learning about the totality of her life, then I would encourage you to do other research and invite you to read the biography that I've put together about her. So what we'll look at today, since we have a limited time period, are 6 things that I think really characterize Lou's tenure as a White House First Lady. The first is that in 1929, very shortly after she arrived in the White House, she invited a congresswoman's wife by the name of Jessie DePriest to tea. And we'll see in just a minute why that was such a notable event. Then we'll talk about Lou's establishment of the President's Mountain School in a small community called Dark Hollow, Virginia, which is near a little wide spot in the road called Kriglersville. Lou was very fascinated and interested in the restoration and preservation of the furnishings of the White House, and we'll take a look at her efforts on behalf of that and also discuss what happened so that we did not know about all the hard work that she had put together. Lou was also a strong supporter of the arts, the first lady to address the nation by radio, and was very active in private philanthropy. Of course, some of the things that we see her involved in now, such as the restoration and preservation efforts that she engaged in and her support of local artists, would resonate with us now. But at the time, it was considered relatively unique and not something that we saw a lot of other first ladies doing. So that's part of the reason why it's not remembered. But another part of the reason is Lou hated publicity. She did not want to call attention to herself. She did not have a good relationship with the reporters who were assigned to cover her. And that in another way also hurt the image that she left and the recollection that people have of her as the First Lady. So let's first talk about Jessie DePriest comes to tea. So you can see by the photograph that Jessie DePriest, Mrs. DePriest, is a Black woman. Her husband, Oscar DePriest, was the first Black member of Congress to be elected since what was considered the long goodbye, when the last member of Congress lost his seat. In my memory, I want to say, was probably 1902. So from 1902 until the 28 election, you had 26 years of no Black people in Congress. When Oscar DePriest, who was from the south side of Chicago, was elected, and I want to point out that until Roosevelt came into office, the majority of Blacks who had the ability to vote were registered and voted as Republicans. So DePriest was a Republican. The Republican Party at the time was radically different than the one that we have today. So when the DePriest came to Washington, the white members of Congress refused to be seated next to him. Members of Congress did not want offices adjacent to his. They did not want him to be assigned to committees. But one of the things that worked in DePriest's favor was that it was a Republican majority in Congress, that Nicholas Longworth, who was the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson, was the Speaker of the House. And through some efforts of actually a friend of Lou's, Ruth Bryan Owen, the daughter of William Jennings Bryan, suggested to Longworth that rather than swear in all of the members of Congress individually, which was the custom, that he do it as a group swearing in so that people could not boycott or prevent DePriest from being sworn in and taking his seat. So that's what's going on in the halls of Congress. In the meanwhile, there is all this social upheaval because now there is a Black congressional spouse. And Washington, for all intents and purposes, was a segregated city. It was very much a Southern city in attitudes. And the idea of having a Black woman at the White House, at congressional social events, was just anathema to the social concepts of the time. But Lou realized that it was important to do something to respect Jessie DePriest's position as the wife of a member of Congress. And she essentially wrote a note to one of Bert's advisors saying, what do we do to recognize her and to honor her. And so the decision came that rather than have one large reception at the White House for all of the congressional spouses, which, with the exception of Ruth Bryan Owen, who was actually a widow, were all women, to have, instead of having just that one event, it was broken in, which was normal. They broke it into a series of events, and they invited the congressional spouses alphabetically. So obviously what happens is you look at the list of who the invitees are, and so you see, let's just say, for example, the first set is last name A through E. You look through that, there's no DePriest, everybody's happy, nobody thinks that, everybody realizes that Lou is going to follow the traditions and shun Mrs. DePriest, and she's going to be excluded from Washington social circles because the First Lady was pretty much the social arbiter, a role that Edith Roosevelt kind of introduced when she became First Lady. But what Lou decided to do was have this private tea. She had a hand-delivered invitation sent to Mrs. DePriest on June 5th, and this would have been 1929. It invited Mrs. DePriest to tea on June 12th, the following week. The messenger was sworn to secrecy. The people who were invited to the tea were several congressional wives that Lou could count on, several cabinet wives that Lou could count on, Lou's sister, Jean Large, and then, of course, Mrs. DePriest. And Mrs. DePriest accepted the invitation and came to the White House. And then all hell broke loose because immediately word got out. People were incensed that Lou had done this. There were legislatures in the southern states that voted resolutions condemning Lou for what she had done. I think if the First Lady could have been impeached, there would have been calls for her impeachment. It obviously impacted Herbert or Bert's public image, the idea that he would, quote unquote, let his wife invite a black woman to the White House. And so things for Lou publicly did not get off to a really good start because this was clearly early in her tenure. Lou was nothing if not determined, some might say stubborn, about how things were going to be. And she had been a cabinet wife for many years, and she had her own understanding of how Washington worked, and she called them Washington cliff dwellers. She was not a fan. So she tried to do her best to forge her own path, which again, in the annals of looking back, by not at least getting the press on her side, she did herself more damage in terms of the way we remember her than she did herself good. But as we might say, her heart was very much in the right place. She wasn't good about communicating where her heart was. Well, one of the things that you're probably aware of is most presidents have retreats, and that had been something that had gone back probably as far back as Grant. And so when Lou and her husband were looking for a retreat, they originally thought maybe they would just get something in Chevy Chase area outside of DC proper, but they realized that they needed to just have something that was geographically distant from Washington, not too far away, because we're still talking very limited roads. We're not talking interstate. Passenger air travel was still relatively new. You don't necessarily want to get on a train, which is, of course, the main form of domestic transportation other than a vehicle. So they looked for something that was within a 2-hour drive and found a property on the Rapidan River in what is now part of the Shenandoah National Park. And they decided to build a retreat there, which became known as Camp Rapidan. Well, in one of the first summer that they were there, Dr. Joel Boone, who was the president's physician, had encountered this 10-year-old boy whose name was Ray Burricker. And he said, "I tell you what, the president's going to be here for his birthday, which is August 9th. If you'll bring him a raccoon as a gift, I will make sure that he gives you $10. And you can imagine that $10 in this remote area is a huge amount of money. So naturally, Ray shows up on the president's birthday, and one of President Hoover's guests is Charles Lindbergh. Well, they introduce Ray to Lindbergh, and they find out that Ray has absolutely no idea who Charles Lindbergh is. And in the course of the discussion, learned that there was no school for these children to attend. As I said, the community they were closest to, Kriglersville, is politely described as a wide spot in the road, and Dark Hollow is even more remote and dispersed than that. And again, no adequate road system, so there's no real easy way to get these children transported to school. And you've got a picture here of the school in snow, so just kind of use your imagination about what that would involve if you're up in the Shenandoah Mountains. So Lou and Bert, with their own funding, working with the County Board of Education, built this school. Lou, with her own money, hired the teacher, Christine Vest, who was experienced in working with rural populations, such as what was going to attend the President's Mountain School. There were donations of books and school supplies. Local people were employed to build the school. Quarters for Christine were built as part of that building that we just saw. 2 extra bedrooms in case the children could not get home because of a snowstorm were also provided. And Lou paid for Miss Vest's salary out of her own pocket, $1,500 a year. She arranged for a horse for Miss Vest so that she would be able to get around the community because could not be a car. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is Lou started getting all of these letters from teachers all over the country who, particularly on the East Coast, who wanted to go visit the school and asked if Lou could arrange it. And one in particular that caught my attention when I was doing my research was a teacher who said she would be coming through Kriglersville on her way to her family's place for the summer, and that she was a teacher and she would really like to stop and visit the President's Mountain School. And Lou said to her, well, I think you need to give Miss Vest an opportunity to become more familiar with what she's doing. She's fairly new at this, but also, are you aware of how difficult it is to get to the President's Mountain School? And she went on to describe how horrible the roads were when it rained and how it could take as much as an hour to get from the Kriglersville community up to this school. So it was very much in a remote area. When the Shenandoah, when the National Park Service took over, because they purchased the area that is now part of the Shenandoah National Park, and they purchased the area that's Camp Rapidan, and those buildings are still there as part of the park. But Christine Vest, in a book that was written about her, noted that when the school was closed and all of the families relocated, that the education that they had received at the school during these short few years it was open really enabled them to slide right into the existing school systems of where they were, or if the students were older, provided an opportunity for them to earn an income. So even though we call it the President's Mountain School, I think for what the level of Lou's engagement was, it probably should have been the First Lady's Mountain School. But again, Lou didn't take credit for things that she did. But she visited regularly. She and the president came at the end of the school year and took them to the county fair as a reward for their school attendance for the year. So it was quite an impactful contribution and engagement. So I mentioned when we were going to go through when I went through the list of what we were going to cover this morning, that Lou was really fascinated about the preservation of the White House furnishings and all the artifacts. And this is a page out of the hand-typed book that was put together by Dare Stark, who was a dear family friend who functioned in many ways as a secretary and assistant to Lou, whom Lou paid out of her own pocket, photos taken paid out of her own pocket. And this is putting together documentation of all the items in this particular room and what the provenance of them were. So just real quick, says it's the green room. It's plate number 46. You have the sofa, and they're all numbered so that then you can go through the material and read what the details were of each item. So she's got the sofa, the tea tables, the consoles, the armchair, the side chair. It's all listed there. And then if you're wondering about the portrait, it is a portrait of Thomas Jefferson by Andrews. And then there's one of Martin Van Buren by Healy. So Lou, after she left the White House, had hoped to get this published. And I did not learn this until I did a presentation at the Hoover Library at the end of June. But what happened was the photographer sold the picture, well, gave permission for a Ladies' Home Journal to publish some of these pictures and publish an article while Lou was still in, excuse me, I've got that wrong. Some of these pictures appeared in Ladies' Home Journal without permission of the photographer. I apologize, got that mixed up. And as a result of that, he was unwilling, he was angry about it, which is understandable. And as a result of it, he would not give his permission for the book to go through. So it's just been uncovered and unearthed within the last 5 or 6 years. And my understanding is efforts are underway to try to get this to see more of the light of day. I do know that White House History Publication did do an insert of it several years ago in one of its journal publications. And then also tied to this was Lou commissioning, again out of her own money, a reproduction of the Monroe desk. As I said, she used local artisans. This was done by a Russian immigrant by the name of Morris Dove, who was located in the DC area. And the desk, it looks fairly simple in this photograph, but it's actually very complex with a series of interchangeable and interconnected locks and knobs for it to have locking mechanisms on the drawers. So Lou paid for this reproduction. I originally went back with the Hoovers after they left the White House, but it's now back in the White House. She also commissioned several of the other Monroe items and a new painting or a copy of an existing painting of Elizabeth Monroe. In case you're wondering, why all of the Monroe furnishings, Monroe had been ambassador to France. The furnishings that Lou had copied, which included an armchair and some tea tables, were actually French furniture that had been made in France. Although ironically, if my research is correct, the tea tables were actually granite that had been mined in Vermont, shipped to France to be formed into the furniture and then sent back, which the Monroes brought back with them when they came back to the United States after serving in the ambassadorship. So Lou was incredibly engaged in personal philanthropy, and there are just a tremendous number of letters in her archives about people that she would send $5 to, $10 to, people that she supported. She paid anonymously for the college educations of people that would get brought to her attention. Lou had always been engaged nationally with various networks through professional associations such as the Mining and Engineers Association, the Women's Division. I should add, if you're not familiar, Lou graduated from Stanford University, and she was their first woman graduate to get a degree in geology. She is also the only scientist that we've ever had as a first lady in the White House. So Lou had a very strong, and she had trained as a teacher prior to that. She had gotten her teaching certificate. So Lou had a very strong interest in education. She had a very strong interest in the sciences. She had a lot of networking among women scientists and women educators across the country. And it was this network of people that she had who would bring special needs, financial needs to her attention. And if and she trusted this network enough that if they said that, this person could be helped by tuition being paid, or this person could be helped if you could just send them $5 or $10, she would do it. But it was done through them so that it was anonymous. And then the ones who were receiving ongoing assistance, she would get periodic reports on how they were doing. So one of the curious things about Lou's private philanthropy is that when she died and her family went through her desk, those who had discovered that she had been their benefactress and had attempted to repay her, their uncashed checks were just scattered in her drawer. And lest you think that Lou maybe just wasn't attentive to finances, Lou was essentially the financial manager for the family. She had been raised as a banker's daughter. She was very attentive to money. So this was not negligence on her part. This was intentional. So this is a letter to Dr. Clore, who is somebody that she met in the Rapidan area. And so what she said was that she was very sorry to hear about the fire in the furniture workshop of Mr. E.A. Clore. And E.A. Clore built furniture that was used at Camp Rapidan. So I'll just read very quickly an excerpt of this. The work being done there had interested myself and some of my friends very much. I cannot but admire the spirit with which relatives and friends are helping him to rebuild this enterprise. So here's the part that talks about her understatement, and then she turns around and is generous. I regret that there are so many demands upon my inadequate means that I can do very little to be of assistance in your refinancing project, but I shall be very glad to take a $200 share of your proposed capital for the rebuilding, not to be paid before 5 years and without interest. I am enclosing my check for that amount. And I would dare say when the check came, she probably didn't cash it. And then this is a note written in her handwriting that in my photograph on my screen is right in the way of what I want to share with you. So let me move that. Okay. This is also regarding Clore, and this is $100 on account to actually hold to purchase materials that he will need for furnishings that she is planning to planning to order from him. I'm sorry. So again, this is just a very small example. Both the decision on the Monroe reproductions, the redoing of Elizabeth Monroe's painting, and now this work with Clore. It's just a little snippet of things that are just scattered throughout her archive of work that she did in her support of private small business, her generosity, and not looking to be repaid. And this is an invoice from E.A. Clore, the person who had lost his furniture shop. And these are beds that had been ordered for Camp Rapidan. So pine beds, felt mattresses, pearless mattresses, perfection springs, and pillows. So the balance total was $172.50. She paid $100 and still owed them $72.50. Okay, so as we're all well aware, the Depression lasted. If you're a good student of history, you will know that we really did not, in spite of all of the efforts that Hoover had attempted, Roosevelt had attempted, Congress, a democratically controlled Congress had attempted to deal with the Depression. We really did not start to come out of it until we entered into World War II, and then the economy retooled to a war economy. So there was depression throughout the nation for a long period of time. And Lou was supported her husband's efforts to find ways to address the Depression, and it was done very differently than what ended up happening under Roosevelt, where so much of it was legislated. The Hoovers were very strong in volunteerism. They were very strong on local and individual efforts. At the time, it was very customary to have what you called $1 a year men and women. These were business people that for quote unquote $1 per year, they would volunteer their services to assist with things with the government. Burt had put together what was called PEACE, P-E-C-E, in the late 1930s. It was the President's Emergency Committee on Employment. Many of Lou's professional friends worked with the women's division. She worked with them. Unfortunately, that committee was not able to come up with solutions to help pull the country out of the Depression. So Lou, realizing that the committee is going to be resolved, both the men's side and the women's side, and also understanding where the mindset of the nation was, addressed the nation by radio from the White House, as you can see in this photograph, and she's flanked by 2 Girl Scouts. So Lou had become a part of the board, National Board of the Girl Scouts in 1917. She had served as its president in the early 20s and then was actually chairman of the board until Burt was elected president in November of 1928. At that point, she resigned as chairman of the board, but what Daisy Lowe had done to try to get First Lady and national support for this new organization that Lowe had founded in 1912 was she had designated the First Ladies as the honorary president. So Lou, of course, steps into the role of the honorary president. But because of her prior involvement with the Girl Scouts, she never really let go of it. And she was still very actively engaged in what maybe not necessarily in board decisions or day-to-day management, but she had a finger on what was happening in the organization. And so Lou gets on the radio and she addresses all the efforts that were made by local communities to try to provide small job employment. The Scouts, who had been very instrumental in canvassing needs for the community and helping them. And it was an attempt to address the somber mood of the nation. What the feedback was on that is something I'm not 100% sure of. It was really difficult to understand that, other than, the papers, of course, were very impressed with the fact that Mrs. Hoover would address the nation by radio, and that it was the first time that a First Lady had done this. Well, what you get then in 1931 is an attempt to resurrect PEACE, P-E-C-E, under a different name. This time what was called POUR, P-O-U-R, it's something about the acronyms, right? The President's Organization for Unemployment Relief. And so again, there was a women's division, and Lou actually gathered the executive council of the Girl Scouts at Camp Rapidan and said, is there something that we might be able to do through scouting to assist with the president's efforts? And a solution that was attributed to Lillian Gilbreth, if you've ever read Cheaper by the Dozen, it's that Lillian Gilbreth, who was an engineer, was to again involve the Scouts with helping homes with their homemaking skills, things that would save money, things that perhaps maybe you and I, depending on your upbringing, might take for granted, canning, preserving food, things that you can do in home with homemaking skills, such as remaking a garment, turning a collar. And the Scouts who had these skills as part of being a Scout could go to various homes and see if there were ways in which they could assist. A lot of the fee, again, POUR didn't work, but what sort of comes through with the Scouts is that it actually strengthened the Scouts as an organization and increased their membership as a result. So one of the other things that Lou tried to do was in helping with the issues of the Depression was that after the cotton crop had become so severely depressed and cotton farmers got pretty much pennies on the dollar for their cotton crop harvested in 1931. Lou commissioned this, 1932. Lou commissioned this cotton dress, which was made from a pattern that had been a favorite of her mother's. You really cannot see it well in this photograph, but it's a cornflower blue woven into the fabric. And she had the dress commissioned. It's 100% cotton, and she wore it to some cabinet receptions. It was remarked that it was the first time a first lady had appeared in a cotton dress in any type of official function since the Civil War era. But her point was to attempt to support the cotton farmers and to call attention to cotton as a fiber that could be used in clothing to help boost cotton consumption. Some of the other things that Lou did to assist with the needs for the Depression were to organize a series of nationwide concerts. Jan Paderewski, who was a very famous and popular pianist at the time, agreed to perform at these concerts and to do it at his own expense. So he did not take any money from the ticket proceeds and donated those proceeds to needs to help unemployed men and women. She also worked with the Junior League in Washington, D.C. to help with a clothing sale, and she was an extremely avid knitter. She knitted sweaters to donate to the Red Cross, again, to help people with clothing needs. And then, as one newspaper put it, Mrs. Hoover came into the role of Santa Claus to do food distribution at a food shelter in Washington, D.C. at Christmas time. So I think that pretty much gives us some time to ask some questions and maybe find out what else you might like to know about Lou. And if you're interested in learning more about her, then you probably can't necessarily follow the link, but if you will go to University of Nebraska Press, Potomac Books, there should be a link there to purchase it. And then if anybody's interested in corresponding with me, this is my email address and what may be left of my website. So, okay, Allison.
Thank you, Annette. That was wonderful. And we did drop a link to the book in the chat to
great.
the class.
All right.
I have a few audience questions here. Did Mrs. Hoover have a personal fortune or funds from which she provided the money for her philanthropy?
Okay, great question. I get asked that pretty commonly. So her money came from a couple of places. Let me start out by saying that the Hoover financial records are permanently sealed. So we don't have 100% knowledge of, excuse me, one second. We really don't know 100% how the money was earned, but there are lots of hints. So first of all, Lou's father, as I said, was a banker. He ended up being financially successful. It was just she and her sister, Jean. So when both parents passed away, their land that they owned was divided between the two sisters. And Lou had her own financial nest egg from her father. She and her sister were involved in real estate, purchased real estate, purchased homes, and were landlords. The best that I can kind of tease out from Lou's money, and this is a little bit of putting that MBA of mine to work, is that the family actually put their funds on what was an organization called West Branch Corporation. So each family member had a share. So Lou had a share, Bert had a share, the two sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan had a share. And what I suspect is a lot of Lou's money came from her portion of the earnings through that corporation. The irony is, in spite of the fact that the Hoovers were pretty well off, she could be as cheap as they came. So it was, the philanthropy was really something that was embedded and deep within her.
There's another question about if you have any speculation as to why President Hoover had Lou's archive sealed.
Well, Allison, this kind of gets back to the conversation we had before we started. All right, audience, I'm not being fair to you. I'm sorry. Allison and I were talking a little bit about how Herbert Hoover was, to put it politely, a little bit not nice to his wife about some things. Yes, he allegedly, the for public reason, and thank you for that question, by the way. The for public reason was that because of how candid she was in her letters, that he didn't want people to get the wrong idea about her because she could be very opinionated. Well, what if, of course, from our 21st century perspective, you say to yourself, well, of course, people are opinionated in their private correspondence. It's their private correspondence. But in all honesty, and it's not a very nice thing to say, I think that he was jealous of her popularity. She was way more personable than he was. She got along better with people than he did. She was more sociable than he was. People really, really loved her. And he took some getting used to. I mean, he had people who were close to him, but he was a little more of she was an incredible extrovert and he was more of an introvert. And if you're an introvert, you know that a lot of people, times you're misunderstood or you don't put that extra effort out. And so that obviously affects people's perception of you. I think Bert was real just intent on getting his reputation as a philanthropist in his own right, somebody who had done a lot in Europe. It was important to him to get his reputation, national reputation, rehabilitated, and he really didn't want anything else getting in the way. And if there had been research into her and speculation about her, his legacy would not have taken preeminence over hers. So I mean, it's not very fair, and it may be totally wrong, but I just think that there was a certain amount of self-preservation and jealousy on his part.
So there were two kinds of follow-up questions if we're talking about late life of Lou Hoover. What was her cause of death? And then he had all this time to sort of solidify his legacy, but people were curious about his love life after she passed. Did he remarry? Was he involved with any women?
Okay, so she died of a heart attack. So the story of her death, which is in one way, I think it's how we all want to go, but it's kind of tragic. She had been to a harp concert and then gone to dinner. She was with a friend and she had gone to dinner. And normally Lou would walk. I mean, she loved physical activity. And they started to walk, and the Hoovers had left California. Well, Lou had left California, shut up the house where she lived. She and Bert kind of lived separate lives. He spent most of his time at a set of apartments they had in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. She spent most of her time in a home she had built on San Juan Hill in Palo Alto, the Stanford University campus in California. And of course, they would get together, but they really went, they separated their own, they went their own way. So Lou kind of shut the house up in 1943 and handwrote a will to her sons and her husband. And she makes a formal move to New York. And so we're now to January 7th, 44. And she went to the harp concert. They start to walk. She doesn't feel well. They take a cab. She comes in. Bert's there. He's getting ready to go out to dinner with a couple of friends. And she goes into her room and shuts the door. And he says to his friends, I just want to tell her, we're going, and say goodnight to her. And he goes in and she was collapsed on the floor. And they called the hotel doctor, but there was nothing they could do. So I found out from talking to Lou's great-granddaughter this summer that there was a history of heart disease in the family. And so she already the great-granddaughter said she really understood that she was not well. So, we all know about heart disease. There wasn't a whole lot done in the 40s. We're still trying to understand about heart disease in women now. So yes, that's what took her. Long-winded answer for that. Sorry, folks. Okay, and then love life, absolutely not a hint of anything. Which I found kind of interesting because it was like, well, he didn't spend a lot of time with her at the end, but apparently she was, to the extent that that's who he was, the love of his life. So no, there was never anybody else. No suggestion of it.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Lou in relation to Eleanor Roosevelt, because as you were talking, I was kind of reflecting on all of these accomplishments of Lou Hoover, and they're very amazing, but so many of them are so overshadowed by Eleanor Roosevelt. So Lou Hoover is the first to speak on the radio, but Eleanor Roosevelt has this great legacy related to the radio. So I'm wondering if you can talk about her in relationship to Eleanor.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. I love the question. So let's look at that on two levels, okay? Let's talk about her interaction with Eleanor first, and then let's talk about what happens with the public perception of these two women and the personalities that kind of govern that. So Lou very graciously invites Eleanor Roosevelt to the White House for a tour, offers to send her a car. Eleanor Roosevelt says, nope, I'll walk from the hotel we're staying in. She arrives unaccompanied. She's just Eleanor, according to Mildred Hall, that's Lou's secretary's recollection, Eleanor is very distant. It's all very perfunctory. She looks at the family room. She, kind of gets a sense of the White House. And then she's there basically 45 minutes. She does not want to stay to tea. She doesn't want to do anything that's particularly social. And then as they're getting ready to leave, it's realized that Mrs. Roosevelt hasn't been shown the White House kitchens. And so Lou leaves Mrs. Roosevelt in the care of Mildred Hall and just, says her goodbyes. So that is the extent, other than seeing each other again on Inauguration Day, that's essentially the extent of that interconnection. Now, remember what I said about the First Lady becomes the honorary president of the Girl Scouts. Well, in 1933, Lou takes over the presidency, the actual presidency, the active role of presidency of the Girl Scouts. And she serves in that role from 33 to 35. So Lou instructed the Scouts to treat Mrs. Roosevelt with the utmost respect, but it was always arranged that when there was a Girl Scout convention or a Girl Scout meeting and Mrs. Roosevelt was going to come speak, it was always arranged that she and Lou never shared the podium. So Lou hated Franklin Roosevelt for lots of reasons, not the least of which, the political defeat of her husband and the depression that set into Bert as a result of that defeat. But also she resented, and I think I include this in the book, she resented the fact that Roosevelt hid his paralysis from the public. She thought it indicated a sneaky personality. And I'll leave you as your own reader and your own interpreter of history to make your own call on that. That was her view. So then we get to, okay, and Allison, thank you. Yes, that's one of the things I really wanted to highlight is that there are a lot of firsts that Lou gets no credit for. So I lay it down to kind of what I alluded to through the talk. Lou hated the press. She did not court the press. I include in the book some material where women members of the press complained about this to some of Lou's assistants, claiming about not having access, claiming about not having interviews. You would think that somebody who championed women professionals, that she would have welcomed and appreciated women journalists for the professionals they were trying to be, because they were pretty much relegated to the social pages. But unfortunately, Lou saw journalists as a whole group and just kind of cast into this sort of almost pariah status as far as she was concerned. If you will remember, one of Eleanor's closest friends, and I think this is right, is Lorena Hickok, who had been a reporter or at least had close connections with the press. Eleanor played the press for all it was worth. And unfortunately, as we well know, and as a friend of mine, when I used to work full time and we used to do seminars for people, and I would have the guy from our press office come in to talk to my audience, he would point out that you have to feel the press is a beast. And if you aren't the one who controls what the beast is going to eat, the beast is going to come up with its own thing. And so Lou didn't control, and they came up with their own approach and their own stories, and Eleanor did, and she gets the benefit of it. So, and then you have to tie the fact that Eleanor, much like Bert, lived into the 60s. She had her columns. She was served in the UN. She kept her legacy out there. She kept herself in front of the public eye, and Lou is completely gone. So you just have a lot of different pieces in that.
So that's really interesting. And I wanted to follow up with a question about Lou's legacy as a scientist, because she, aside from being a first lady, she was the first woman to graduate from Stanford with a geology degree. She translated a major Latin text. And it's so interesting to me. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that piece of her life.
Sure. So Bert was a mining engineer, and he traveled all over the world. He was not a good writer. He almost didn't graduate from Stanford because he couldn't pass freshman English. So I have a feeling that there was a certain woman who came into his life when he was a senior who may have coached him through that. Her name was Lou Henry. So she helped him with his reports, and he published some books. She was his editor, copy editor. He never gave her credit. And then, as you pointed out, they got hold of this Latin text called De Re Metallica. It was written in, I want to say, the 14 or 1500s. And it was still a seminal work on mining. The things that he used the pen name Georgius Agricolas, which is, George of agriculture. He really understood the mining techniques, but a lot of the problem was not only was it written in Latin, but he made up terms. So you kind of had to have some kind of understanding of language, which Lou was had huge facility for. So between Bert's knowledge of how those mining terms applied and Lou's understanding of how to interpret those terms and what was really being said there, the two of them collaborated on this translation, and they were awarded the first gold medal for that book in 1913, American Mining and Metallurgical Society. They published it under their own dime. It's published in a very super high quality edition. They gave it to friends and colleagues that they thought would benefit from the book. And from what I have been able to ascertain, that book is still in use today. There's nothing that surpasses it for the depth of knowledge of mining that is in that book. One other writing that Lou did, other than her work with the various metallurgical and mining societies, women's engineer societies, was to publish a monograph on a seismologist, John Milne, who had studied earthquakes in Japan. Perhaps the other thing that she did is to try to encourage women to be in science and not to let them think that womanhood was going to get in their way. It wasn't going to be less feminine to be a scientist, which we're still dealing with those issues today.
Well, Annette, I could ask you more questions about Lou Hoover all day, but I want to thank you for this fascinating, insightful look at Lou Hoover in the White House and for further discussing her life with us. This has been a great legacy lecture. We're so happy to have you here, and we're so excited about the book. And we want to encourage people to check out this book, A Woman in Adventure, The Life and Times of First Lady Lou Henry Hoover. There's a link in the chat, and we'll put a link in the notes on our YouTube page. So thank you, Annette Dunlap. This has been an amazing legacy lecture.
Thank you.
And we want to thank everyone for being here and encourage you to go to the National First Ladies Library Eventbrite page and connect with us either virtually through some of our programs or at the National First Ladies Historic Site. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.